Breonna Taylor's hands trembled as she counted the cash for the third time that morning. $5,000. She tucked it into an envelope and sealed it quickly, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. Behind her, she heard footsteps in the hallway of the mansion she now called home. She shoved the envelope into her purse and tried to steady her breathing. "Breonna? Are you in the study?" Daniel's voice carried warmth and concern, the same tone he'd used since their wedding 3 months ago. "Just finishing some paperwork," she called back, forcing brightness into her voice. She caught her reflection in the ornate mirror above the mahogany desk. A beautiful African-American woman in a red silk dress stared back at her, but the eyes held secrets that no expensive clothing could hide. This wasn't who she wanted to be. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she first picked up a paintbrush at age 7. But here she was, Mrs. Daniel Morrison, wife of a millionaire, and a liar. The whole thing had started 6 months earlier, when her world was falling apart in ways she never could have predicted. Breonna had been standing in County General Hospital, watching her grandmother struggle to breathe through an oxygen mask. The doctor had pulled her aside with that expression medical professionals wear when they're about to destroy your life with statistics and treatment plans you can't afford. "Miss Taylor, your grandmother needs immediate surgery. The mass on her lung is growing rapidly. Without intervention within the next 2 months, I'm afraid." He trailed off, but Breonna understood. Her grandmother, the woman who'd raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 9, was going to die. How much? Breonna had asked, though she already knew she didn't have it. "The surgery alone is $60,000. Then there's the follow-up treatments, medications, rehabilitation. We're looking at close to $200,000 total over the next year." $200,000. Breonna made maybe $20,000 a year selling her paintings at local galleries and coffee shops. Her tiny studio apartment in the warehouse district cost $1,500 a month, which she could barely afford. She had $300 in her checking account and a mountain of student loan debt from art school. She'd taken her grandmother's frail hand that day and made a promise. "I'll figure it out, Grandma. I'll find a way." Her grandmother, Florence Taylor, had squeezed her hand weakly. "Baby girl, you've always been stronger than you know. But don't you do anything foolish for an old woman like me." Breonna had smiled and lied. "I won't, Grandma. I promise." That had been the first lie. Everything that followed was built on that foundation of desperate love and impossible choices. She'd started by applying for loans, talking to hospital financial advisors, starting a crowdfunding page. She'd gotten $15,000 from generous strangers on the internet, which felt like a miracle until she realized how far it fell short. The bank had laughed at her loan application. Her credit score was too low, her income too unstable. Her landlord had served her with an eviction notice for being 2 months behind on rent. Her art studio, the converted garage where she created her paintings, was going to be torn down for new development. Everything was collapsing at once. Then came the gallery opening. Breonna had been invited to display her work at the Riverside Gallery, a mid-level venue that attracted local collectors and art enthusiasts. She'd spent weeks preparing her best pieces, hoping to make enough sales to at least buy her grandmother a few more months. The opening was on a Friday evening, and Breonna had worn her only nice dress, a blue sheath she'd bought at a thrift store. The gallery was full of people sipping wine and making polite comments about brushstrokes and color palettes. Breonna had sold 2 small paintings for $500 each. It was better than nothing but nowhere near enough. She'd been standing in front of her largest piece, a portrait of her grandmother titled, "Grace in Twilight," when she heard a man's voice behind her. "This is remarkable. The way you've captured the light in her eyes, the dignity in her expression. This is someone you love very much." Breonna had turned to find a man in his late 30s studying her painting with genuine interest. He was tall, with light brown hair and kind blue eyes. He wore an expensive suit but had loosened his tie, as if he'd come straight from an office and hadn't bothered to go home and change. "Thank you," Breonna had said. "That's my grandmother. She must be an incredible woman to inspire something this powerful." He'd extended his hand. "I'm Daniel Morrison. Breonna Taylor." She'd shaken his hand, noticing the firm but gentle grip. "Are you the artist?" "Yes." He'd looked at her, then really looked at her and smiled. "Would you walk me through your collection? I'd love to understand your process." They'd spent an hour together that evening. Daniel had asked thoughtful questions about her inspiration, her techniques, her vision for her work. He'd made her laugh with stories about his complete lack of artistic talent. He'd been genuinely interested in her as a person, not just her paintings. At the end of the night, he'd bought 6 paintings. $12,000 total. I'd like to commission more work, he'd said, handing her his business card. I'm renovating my office building and I want to feature local artists. Would you be interested? Brianna had stared at the card. Morrison Tech Solutions. Geo. Yes, she'd said, trying not to sound too desperate. I'd be very interested. That should have been it. A business transaction. A lucky break for a struggling artist. But Daniel had called her 3 days later, not about the commission, but to invite her to dinner. I can't stop thinking about your work, he'd said. Or about our conversation. Would you have dinner with me? Just to talk more about art and life. Brianna should have said no. She should have kept things professional. But she'd looked at the hospital bills stacked on her kitchen counter and heard her grandmother's labored breathing over the phone that morning, and she'd said yes. Over the next month, Daniel had courted her with an earnestness that made her heart ache. He'd taken her to art museums and small cafes. He'd listened to her talk about her childhood with her grandmother, her struggles as an artist, her dreams for the future. He'd shared his own story about building his tech company from nothing, about losing his parents young too, about feeling lonely despite his success. Brianna had found herself genuinely liking him. He was kind, thoughtful, funny. He treated servers with respect and remembered details about her life. He never flaunted his wealth or made her feel small for her struggles, which made what she was planning even worse. The idea had come to her late one night, 3 weeks into their dating. Her grandmother had been rushed to the emergency room with breathing complications. The doctor had said they were running out of time. The surgery needed to happen soon. Brianna had been sitting in the hospital waiting room, tears streaming down her face, when she'd gotten a text from Daniel asking if she was okay. She'd told him about her grandmother, and he'd shown up at the hospital within an hour, despite it being 2 in the morning. He'd sat with her until dawn, holding her hand, bringing her coffee, just being present. When the doctor had finally said her grandmother was stable, Daniel had driven Brianna home and made sure she had breakfast before he left for work. That was when she'd realized that Daniel Morrison was falling in love with her. And that was when she'd made the terrible decision that led her to this moment, 3 months married and counting cash in secret. She'd decided to make him fall completely in love with her. To marry him. To use his wealth to save her grandmother's life. It was manipulation. It was wrong. It was the most morally questionable thing she'd ever done. But when she weighed her ethics against her grandmother's life, the choice had been brutally clear. So here's something to think about. Could you make the same choice Brianna did? Would you trade your integrity for the life of someone you love? Drop a comment below with your honest answer, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because Daniel is about to discover everything, and the fallout will change both their lives forever. Now, standing in Daniel's study with an envelope full of cash she'd secretly withdrawn from their joint account, Brianna felt the weight of every lie she'd told. The marriage license. The wedding vows. The I love you she'd whispered last night, even though she wasn't sure if it was true or just part of the performance. Daniel appeared in the doorway and Brianna's heart jumped. He looked tired, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his expression concerned. Are you feeling all right? You've seemed distracted lately. I'm fine, Brianna lied, adding another brick to the wall of deception between them. Just thinking about my next series of paintings. He walked over and pulled her into a gentle embrace. She stiffened for a moment, then forced herself to relax into his arms. He smelled like coffee and the cologne she'd bought him for his birthday last month. I worry about you sometimes, he said softly. I want you to know you can tell me anything. If something's wrong, if you need help, I'm here. Brianna closed her eyes, guilt washing over her in waves. I know, she whispered. Thank you. If only he knew that the help she needed was his money, and she'd already taken it without asking. If only he knew that their entire relationship was built on her desperate calculations rather than organic feelings. But he'd find out soon enough. That was the problem with lies. They always came to light eventually, and when they did, they burned everything in their path. Daniel pulled back and looked at her with those kind blue eyes that had trusted her from the beginning. I have a meeting this afternoon, but I'll be home for dinner. Maybe we can cook together? I know you love that pasta carbonara we made last month. That sounds perfect, Brianna said, managing a smile. He kissed her forehead and left the study, completely unaware that his wife was stealing from him to save her grandmother's life. Completely unaware that everything he believed about their love story was a carefully constructed fiction. Brianna grabbed her purse with the envelope inside and headed for the door. She had a hospital payment to make, and after that she had to come home and pretend to be the loving wife Daniel deserved but didn't actually have. As she drove through the city in the expensive car Daniel had bought her, Brianna tried not to think about what would happen when the truth came out. Because it would come out. Secrets like this never stayed buried forever. She just hoped she'd have enough time to save her grandmother first. After that, she could deal with the consequences. After that, she could face Daniel's betrayal and hurt. After that, she could try to become someone she could stand to see in the mirror again. But for now, she had to keep lying. Keep pretending. Keep being the woman Daniel Morrison had fallen in love with, even though that woman didn't really exist. The hospital loomed ahead and Brianna parked in the visitor lot. She walked through the automatic doors with her envelope of stolen cash, ready to buy her grandmother another month of life with money that wasn't hers. This was love, she told herself. This was what you did for family. You made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. But deep down, in the parts of herself she tried not to examine too closely, Brianna wondered if she was really doing this for her grandmother or if she was just a coward who couldn't face loss like a normal person. If she was using love as an excuse for theft and deception. She pushed the thoughts away and walked to the billing office. There would be time for self-reflection later. Right now, she had a grandmother to save and a husband to betray. The woman behind the desk looked up with a professional smile. "How can I help you today?" "I'm here to make a payment for Florence Taylor," Brianna said, sliding the envelope across the counter. "For her surgery next week." As she watched the woman count the cash, Brianna felt the full weight of what she'd become. A thief. A liar. A woman who married for money and called it love. But also a granddaughter who refused to let the person who raised her die when she had the power to prevent it, no matter what that power cost her soul. Brianna had almost canceled the gallery showing 6 months ago. The night before the opening, she'd been in her cramped studio apartment, staring at the paintings she'd spent months creating, wondering if anyone would even care. Her grandmother had been newly diagnosed, the medical bills were already starting to pile up, and Brianna had exactly $1,400 in her bank account. She'd picked up her phone a dozen times, ready to call the gallery owner and make some excuse. But each time she'd remembered her grandmother's words from when she'd first decided to pursue art. "Baby girl, you've got to show the world what you can do. Can't nobody see your light if you keep it hidden." So she'd loaded her paintings into her ancient Honda Civic and driven to the Riverside Gallery on Friday afternoon, setting up her display with hands that shook from exhaustion and fear. The opening was at 7. She'd gone home, showered, put on her blue thrift store dress and returned by 6:30. The gallery owner, Patricia Chin, had given her an encouraging smile. "Your work is beautiful, Brianna. Don't look so nervous. Tonight is your night." But Brianna had been nervous. This was more than just an art show. This was potentially her last chance to make money before her grandmother's condition worsened. She needed sales. She needed them desperately. The first hour had been agonizing. People had wandered through, making polite comments, sipping cheap wine from plastic cups. A few had lingered in front of her paintings, but no one had reached for their wallets. Brianna had smiled until her face hurt, answered questions about her process, tried not to think about the eviction notice tucked in her purse. Then an elderly woman had bought one of her smaller pieces for $250. Brianna had nearly cried with relief. 30 minutes later, a young couple had purchased another for the same price. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was something. By 8:30 she'd sold 4 paintings for a total of $1,000. Patricia had been pleased, saying it was a good night for a new artist. Brianna had nodded and smiled, even though she'd needed 10 times that amount to make a real difference. She'd been standing in front of Grace in Twilight, her portrait of her grandmother, when she'd heard footsteps behind her. The gallery was less crowded now, just a handful of stragglers finishing their wine and making their final rounds. "This is remarkable." The voice had been deep and warm. Brianna had turned to find a man she hadn't seen before, someone who'd apparently arrived late to the showing. He'd been studying her painting with an intensity that surprised her. Most people glanced and moved on, but this man was really looking. "Thank you," she'd said, her standard response. "The way you've captured the light in her eyes, the dignity in her expression. This is someone you love very much." That had caught her off guard. Most people commented on technique or color choices. This man had gone straight to the emotional core of the piece. "That's my grandmother," Brianna had said, feeling suddenly exposed. He'd looked at her, then really looked at her and smiled. It had been a genuine smile, not the polite expression people wore at gallery openings. She must be an incredible woman to inspire something this powerful. She is. Brianna had felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes but forced them back. "She raised me after my parents died. I'm sorry for your loss." He'd extended his hand. "I'm Daniel Morrison. Brianna Taylor." His handshake had been firm but gentle, and he'd held her gaze in a way that felt respectful rather than intrusive. Up close, she'd noticed details: the expensive cut of his suit, the watch that probably cost more than her rent, but also the loosened tie and the kind lines around his eyes. "Are you the artist behind all these pieces?" "Yes. They're exceptional. Would you walk me through your collection? I'd love to understand your process." That had been the moment everything changed, though Brianna hadn't known it yet. She'd walked him through her paintings, explaining her inspiration for each piece. A landscape of the neighborhood where she'd grown up. A portrait of the old man who ran the corner store and had always snuck her free candy as a kid. Abstract pieces representing emotions she couldn't put into words. Daniel had listened like her words mattered. He'd asked thoughtful questions. "What made you choose these particular shades of blue? How long did you work on this piece? What were you feeling when you painted this?" He'd made her laugh too, with self-deprecating stories about his own complete lack of artistic ability. "I once took a painting class in college," he'd said. "The instructor told me I had a unique vision. I'm pretty sure that was a polite way of saying I couldn't paint to save my life." They'd talked for over an hour, long enough that Patricia had started giving Brianna curious looks from across the gallery. By the time they'd circled back to Grace in Twilight, Brianna had felt more relaxed than she had in months. "I'd like to buy this one," Daniel had said, along with 5 others. "The landscape of your neighborhood, the portrait of the shopkeeper, and those 3 abstracts about grief and hope and resilience." Brianna's heart had stopped. "All 6? "Yes." "How much for all of them?" She'd done the math in her head, trying to keep her voice steady. $12,000. He hadn't even blinked. "Done. Can you have them delivered to my office? I'll give you the address." $12,000. More money than she'd made in 6 months. More money than she'd hoped to make in a year. She'd felt dizzy with relief. "Of course," she'd managed to say. Daniel had pulled out his business card and handed it to her. Brianna had read it twice to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. "Morrison Tech Solutions. Chief Executive Officer. I'd also like to commission more work," he'd continued. "I'm renovating my office building downtown, and I want to feature local artists. Would you be interested in creating a series for our main lobby? Maybe 8 to 10 pieces?" "Yes," Brianna had said, probably too quickly. "I'd be very interested." "Perfect. Why don't you think about it for a few days and we can meet next week to discuss details?" He'd smiled. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Brianna. Your work is truly special." After he'd left, Brianna had stood in the middle of the gallery, holding his business card and trying to process what had just happened. Patricia had rushed over, eyes wide. "Do you know who that was?" "Daniel Morrison built one of the most successful tech companies in the state. He's worth millions. And he just bought 6 of your paintings." Brianna had nodded, still in shock. "He wants to commission more." "That's incredible, honey. This could change everything for you." It could. $12,000 would cover 3 months of her grandmother's treatments. A big commission could cover even more. For the first time since the diagnosis, Brianna had felt a flutter of hope. She'd gone straight to the hospital that night, even though it was past visiting hours. She'd sweet-talked the night nurse into letting her peek into her grandmother's room, just to see her sleeping peacefully with oxygen tubes in her nose and monitors beeping steadily. "I'm going to save you, Grandma," she'd whispered from the doorway. "I found a way." Over the next 3 days, Brianna had worked on ideas for the commission, sketching concepts and planning color schemes. She'd been genuinely excited about the project, not just because of the money but because Daniel had responded to her art on a level most people didn't. When he'd called on Tuesday to schedule their meeting, she'd expected a professional discussion about contract terms and deadlines. Instead, he'd said, "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I can't stop thinking about your work. Or about our conversation. Would you have dinner with me? Just to talk more about art and life." Brianna should have said no. She'd known it even then. This was a business relationship, and mixing business with personal was always complicated. But she'd been standing in her kitchen looking at hospital bills and rent notices, and she'd heard herself say, "I'd like that." Their first date had been at a small Italian restaurant downtown. Daniel had arrived 10 minutes early and stood when she'd walked in, pulling out her chair like something from an old movie. They'd talked for 3 hours, long after they'd finished eating. He told her about building his company from scratch in his 20s, about the long nights and near failures, about finally finding success but realizing he'd sacrificed his personal life in the process. "I looked up one day and realized I was 38 years old, successful in business and completely alone," he'd said. "No close friends, no relationships, just work." Brianna had shared her own story, carefully editing the current crisis with her grandmother. She talked about losing her parents at 9, about Florence stepping in to raise her, about pursuing art despite everyone telling her to be practical. "My grandmother never questioned my choices," she'd said. "When I told her I wanted to go to art school instead of getting a teaching degree, she just said, 'Baby girl, life's too short to be practical all the time. Follow your heart.'" "She sounds like a wise woman," Daniel had said. "She is." He'd walked her to her car after dinner, and before she'd left he'd asked, "Can I see you again? Not for business, just to see you?" Brianna had looked at him, really looked at him, and seen genuine interest in his eyes. She'd also seen an opportunity, though she'd hated herself for thinking that way. "Yes," she'd said. "I'd like that." Over the next month they'd seen each other 3 times a week. Coffee dates and museum visits and long walks through the park. Daniel had been attentive and kind, always asking about her day, her art, her life. He'd made her laugh. He'd listened when she talked. He'd been, in every way, exactly the kind of person she would have wanted to date under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. 3 weeks into their relationship, her grandmother had been rushed to the emergency room. Brianna had gotten the call at midnight and had driven straight to the hospital, terrified. The doctors had stabilized Florence, but they'd also been clear: time was running out. The surgery needed to happen soon. Brianna had been sitting in the waiting room at 2 in the morning, crying silently, when Daniel had texted to ask how her evening was going. She typed out a polite response, deleted it, and then, in a moment of exhaustion, had told him the truth. "I'm at County General. My grandmother had a medical emergency. She's stable now, but I'm scared." 20 minutes later, Daniel had walked through the hospital doors. He'd found her in the waiting room and had sat down beside her without a word, just taking her hand in his. They'd sat like that for hours. He'd gotten her coffee from the vending machine. He'd let her cry on his shoulder. He'd been there, steady and solid, when she'd felt like her world was crumbling. "I don't understand," she'd said at one point. "Why are you here?" "It's the middle of the night." "Because you needed someone," he'd said simply. "And I care about you." That had been the moment Brianna's plan had crystallized into something real and terrible. Daniel Morrison was falling in love with her. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the way he'd dropped everything to be at the hospital, the way he held her hand like it was precious. And she could use that. She could use his feelings to save her grandmother's life. It would be wrong. It would be manipulation. But it would work. The thought had made her sick, but not sick enough to abandon it. Because when she'd weighed her ethics against her grandmother's life, there was no real contest. So she'd let Daniel drive her home that morning. She'd let him make her breakfast. She'd let him believe that his kindness and care were building a foundation for genuine love. And she'd started planning how to make him propose. After that night at the hospital, everything changed. Daniel had texted her every morning to ask how her grandmother was doing. He'd sent flowers to Florence's hospital room with a card that read, "Get well soon. The world needs more wise women like you." He'd asked Brianna out 3 more times that week, and each time she'd said yes. She told herself at first that she was just being open to possibilities, that maybe this could become something real, that she didn't have to make any concrete decisions yet. But 2 weeks later, when the hospital's billing department had called to inform her that her grandmother's surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks out and the $60,000 deposit was due in 3 weeks, Brianna had stopped lying to herself about what she was doing. She was going to make Daniel Morrison fall so deeply in love with her that he'd want to marry her. And then she was going to use his money to save her grandmother. It was calculated. It was cold. It was the worst thing she'd ever contemplated. But she was going to do it anyway. The first step had been easy. Daniel was already interested in her, already pursuing her with the kind of focused attention that suggested serious feelings. Brianna just had to encourage him, to be available and warm and everything he was looking for in a partner. They'd gone on a date to the art museum, walking through the galleries hand in hand. Daniel had stopped in front of a massive abstract painting and asked what she saw in it. "Chaos trying to become order," she'd said. "Or maybe order falling apart into chaos. It depends on how you look at it." "That's how I feel about my life sometimes," he'd admitted. "I built this successful company, created this orderly existence, but underneath it all, there's this sense that I'm missing something essential." "What do you think you're missing?" He'd looked at her, then really looked at her. "Connection. Purpose beyond work. Someone to share life with." Brianna's heart had twisted. He was opening up to her, being vulnerable, and she was planning to exploit that vulnerability. But she'd pushed the guilt down and squeezed his hand. "I think we all feel that way sometimes," she'd said. Like we're searching for something we can't quite name. They'd had dinner after the museum, at a rooftop restaurant with views of the city. Daniel had ordered wine, a bottle that probably cost more than Brianna's monthly grocery budget. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. I used to be afraid of failing, Daniel had said. Now I'm more afraid of succeeding at things that don't matter. What matters to you? Brianna had asked. This, he'd said, gesturing between them. Being here with you. Feeling like I'm connecting with someone who sees me as more than just a business owner or a bank account. The irony had been crushing. Brianna had smiled and lifted her wine glass. To connections that matter. They'd clinked glasses, and Brianna had felt like the worst person in the world. Over the next 3 weeks, she'd continued the calculated courtship. She'd introduced Daniel to her favorite coffee shop, the tiny place near her apartment where she'd spent countless mornings sketching. She'd taken him to the park where her grandmother used to push her on the swings as a child. She'd shown him pieces of her life, her history, her heart. And Daniel had responded exactly as she'd hoped he would. He'd fallen deeper in love with each shared moment, each story, each glimpse into who she was. He'd started saying, "I love you" after 6 weeks. They'd been at his apartment, cooking dinner together, when he turned to her with flour on his hands and said, "I love you, Brianna. I know it's fast, but I can't help it. I love you." She'd frozen, wooden spoon in hand, staring at him. This was what she'd been working toward, but hearing the actual words had made it real in a way that planning hadn't. "I love you too," she'd said, and hated herself for not knowing if it was true. Because the terrible thing was, part of her did love him. Daniel was kind and thoughtful and genuinely good. He treated her with respect. He listened to her ideas. He made her laugh. Under different circumstances, she could have fallen in love with him naturally, without calculation or ulterior motives. But these weren't different circumstances. She had 3 days until the hospital deposit was due and exactly $3,000 in her account. She needed $57,000 more, and she needed it fast. That night, lying next to Daniel in his bed, Brianna had worked up the courage to have a conversation she'd been dreading. "Daniel, I need to tell you something about my grandmother." He'd rolled over to face her, concern immediate in his eyes. "Is she okay? Did something happen?" "She needs surgery. It's expensive and I don't have the money to cover it." She'd laid it out plainly. The diagnosis, the cost, her financial situation. She'd watched Daniel's face as he processed the information, saw the moment he understood the weight she'd been carrying. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he'd asked gently. "Pride, I guess. And shame." "It's not your problem. Brianna, look at me." He'd cupped her face in his hands. "If you're hurting, it's my problem. If someone you love needs help, it's my problem. Because I love you, and that means your struggles are my struggles too. I can't ask you to pay for her surgery," Brianna had said, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. "That's not why I'm telling you." "I know. But I'm offering. Let me help. Please." This was it. The moment she'd been working toward. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she'd felt sick. "Daniel, that's $60,000 just for the deposit. The whole treatment plan is over $200,000. I can afford it," he'd said simply. "And more importantly, I want to help. Your grandmother raised you. She's the reason you're the person I fell in love with. Of course I want to help her." Brianna had started crying then, real tears that came from a place she couldn't control. They were tears of relief that her grandmother would get the care she needed. Tears of gratitude for Daniel's kindness. And tears of shame for manipulating him into this moment. "Thank you," she'd whispered. "I'll pay you back. All of it. I promise. I don't want you to pay me back. I want your grandmother to be healthy. That's all." He'd held her while she cried, stroking her hair and making soothing sounds. And Brianna had let herself be comforted by the man she was deceiving, adding another layer to her growing mountain of guilt. The next day, Daniel had gone to the hospital and paid the $60,000 deposit in full. He'd met Florence for the first time, sitting by her bedside and chatting with her about Brianna's childhood. Her grandmother had liked him immediately. "He's a good man," Florence had told Brianna later. "Don't let this one get away." "I won't, Grandma," Brianna had promised, wondering what her grandmother would think if she knew the truth about how they'd gotten together. The surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Daniel had paid for everything up front, refusing to let Brianna worry about money during what was already a stressful time. He'd taken days off work to be at the hospital during the operation. He'd held Brianna's hand in the waiting room for 9 hours while surgeons removed the mass from her grandmother's lung. When the doctor had finally come out to tell them the surgery was successful, Daniel had been the one to catch Brianna when her knees gave out from relief. He'd been her rock, her support, her partner through the worst crisis of her life. And 2 days later, when Florence was stable and recovering well, Daniel had proposed. They'd been in the hospital garden, taking a break from the intensive care unit. It was a beautiful spring afternoon, with flowers blooming and birds singing. Daniel had led Brianna to a bench under a cherry tree and had gotten down on one knee. "Brianna Taylor, I know we've only been together for 2 months. I know some people would say this is too fast. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You've brought joy and meaning to my world. You've made me feel alive in a way I didn't know was possible. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" He'd pulled out a ring, a simple but beautiful diamond that caught the afternoon light. Brianna had stared at it, at him, at the hope and love in his eyes. This was what she'd worked toward. This was the goal she'd been manipulating him toward for weeks. She should say yes. She should secure the financial stability that would ensure her grandmother got all the follow-up care she needed. But in that moment, looking at Daniel's earnest face, Brianna had felt the full weight of what she was about to do. She was about to marry a man for his money. She was about to make vows she wasn't sure she meant. She was about to commit to a lifetime built on lies. "Yes," she'd said, because there was no other choice. "Yes, I'll marry you." Daniel had slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her, and Brianna had kissed him back, sealing a deal that felt more like a devil's bargain than a romantic engagement. They'd told her grandmother that evening. Florence had cried with happiness, saying she'd known from the moment she met Daniel that he was the one for Brianna. The nurses had congratulated them. Everything had been perfect. Except for the cold knot of guilt in Brianna's stomach that wouldn't go away no matter how much she tried to rationalize her choices. They'd gotten married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony. Daniel had wanted to give Brianna time to plan the wedding of her dreams, but she'd insisted on something quick and simple. The truth was, she couldn't stand the idea of months of pretending, of wedding planning built on deception. Her grandmother had attended from a wheelchair, weak but healing. Daniel's business partner had been his best man. Patricia from the gallery had been Brianna's maid of honor. It had been beautiful and intimate and everything a wedding should be. Brianna had worn a green dress because she'd read somewhere that white symbolized purity, and she'd felt like a fraud wearing it. She'd said her vows in a steady voice, promising to love and honor Daniel for the rest of her life. She'd meant every word in that moment, or at least she'd wanted to mean them. Daniel had looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. His vows had been heartfelt and specific, mentioning the moment he'd first seen her painting, the night at the hospital, the way she made him laugh. He'd cried when he'd promised to stand by her through everything life brought them. And Brianna had stood there in her green dress, feeling like the worst person who'd ever lived. But she'd done it. She'd married Daniel Morrison. She'd secured the financial resources to save her grandmother. She'd accomplished her goal. Now all she had to do was live with what she'd done. The morning of the wedding, Brianna had woken up in her old studio apartment for the last time. The eviction had been postponed when she'd told her landlord she was getting married and moving out. Her few belongings were already packed in boxes, ready to be moved to Daniel's mansion. She'd sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the green dress hanging on the back of the door. In a few hours she'd be Mrs. Daniel Morrison. She'd have access to wealth beyond anything she'd ever imagined. Her grandmother would have the best medical care available. And she'd be living a lie. Her phone had buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Good morning, soon-to-be wife. I can't wait to see you today. I love you." Brianna had typed back, "I love you too. See you soon." She'd looked at those words for a long time. Did she love him? She cared about him. She admired him. She was grateful to him. But was that love, or just a convenient emotion to layer over her guilt? Patricia had arrived at 9 to help her get ready. "You're making the right choice," she'd said, helping Brianna with her makeup. "Daniel is a wonderful man. And anyone can see how much he loves you." "I know," Brianna had said, staring at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked beautiful. She looked happy. She looked nothing like the fraud Brianna knew herself to be. The ceremony was at a small botanical garden, Daniel's choice because he knew Brianna loved flowers and nature. When Brianna had arrived with Patricia, she'd been stunned by how beautiful it was. White chairs set up in rows, an arch covered in roses, string quartet playing softly. Daniel had spared no expense, even for a small wedding. Everything was perfect. Florence had been there, sitting in her wheelchair in the front row, wearing a lavender dress and looking healthier than she had in months. The surgery had been successful. The initial treatments were working. She was going to live. That's what mattered, Brianna had reminded herself. Her grandmother was going to live. Whatever choices Brianna had made, whatever compromises with her integrity, they'd accomplished that goal. When the music had changed and it was time for Brianna to walk down the aisle, Patricia had given her a quick hug. "You look beautiful. Now go marry that man." Brianna had walked slowly between the chairs, bouquet of wildflowers in hand, eyes locked on Daniel waiting for her under the rose arch. He'd been wearing a navy suit, and when he'd seen her, his whole face had lit up with joy. That look had almost broken her. He was so genuinely happy, so genuinely in love, and she was so genuinely deceptive. The officiant had spoken about love and commitment and partnership. Brianna had heard the words as if from a distance, her mind racing with all the reasons this was wrong and all the reasons she had to go through with it anyway. Then it had been time for vows. Daniel had gone first. "Brianna, from the moment I saw your painting of your grandmother, I knew you were someone special. Someone who understood that real beauty comes from love and sacrifice and dedication to the people who matter. Over these past months, you've shown me what it means to truly live, not just exist. You've brought color and warmth and meaning to my world. I promise to support your art, to honor your independence, to cherish your grandmother as my own family, and to love you with everything I am for the rest of my life." He'd been crying by the end, tears streaming down his face unashamed. Several guests had been crying too. Even Patricia was dabbing at her eyes. Then it had been Brianna's turn. She'd looked at Daniel, at his kind face and honest eyes, and had felt the full weight of what she was about to say. "Daniel, you came into my life during the darkest time I've ever faced. You brought light when I thought all the light was gone. You've shown me kindness and generosity and a love I didn't think existed outside of movies. I promise to stand by you, to support your dreams, to be your partner through whatever life brings us. I promise to honor this commitment and to work every day to be worthy of the faith you've placed in me." She'd chosen her words carefully. She hadn't said she loved him, not in the vows. She'd said what was true, that he'd helped her, that she was grateful, that she would try to be a good partner. It had been the most honest she could be under the circumstances. If Daniel had noticed the omission, he hadn't shown it. He just smiled at her with so much love that she'd felt it like a physical weight. "Do you, Daniel Morrison, take Brianna Taylor to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Do you, Brianna Taylor, take Daniel Morrison to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Brianna had paused for just a moment. This was her last chance. She could say no. She could walk away. She could face her grandmother's illness without Daniel's money and deal with the consequences. But she'd looked at Florence in her wheelchair, at the woman who'd raised her and loved her and sacrificed everything for her, and she'd said, "I do." They'd exchanged rings. The officiant had pronounced them husband and wife. Daniel had kissed her, gentle and reverent, and everyone had applauded. Brianna Taylor was now Brianna Morrison. The deed was done. The reception had been small, just close friends and a few of Daniel's business associates. They'd had dinner in the garden's pavilion, dancing under string lights, cutting a simple cake that Daniel had insisted be chocolate because it was Brianna's favorite. He'd been attentive all evening, making sure she was comfortable, introducing her to people, looking at her like she was the most important person in the room. Florence had given a short speech about how happy she was to see her granddaughter marry such a good man. Daniel's business partner had made a toast about finally seeing Daniel find happiness outside of work. Everything had been perfect. A fairy tale wedding for a relationship built on deception. That night, they'd gone back to Daniel's mansion. Brianna's mansion now, she supposed, though it still felt like his. He'd carried her over the threshold in the traditional way, both of them laughing. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison," he'd said. "It's strange hearing that name," Brianna had admitted. "You'll get used to it." He'd set her down gently. "I know this house is big and probably overwhelming. We can redecorate however you want. Make it feel like yours too." "It's beautiful," she'd said, looking around at the marble floors and high ceilings. "I just need time to adjust." They'd gone upstairs to the master bedroom, and for the first time, the reality of what she'd done had truly hit Brianna. This was her life now. This house, this man, this marriage built on lies. There was no going back. Daniel had been gentle and patient that night, seemingly understanding her nervousness. Afterward, he'd held her close and told her again how much he loved her, how lucky he felt to have found her. And Brianna had laid there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of her new bedroom, wondering how long she could maintain this pretense before the weight of it crushed her. But she'd done what she'd set out to do. Her grandmother was safe. The medical bills were paid. Florence would get all the follow-up treatments she needed. That had to count for something, even if the cost was Brianna's integrity and peace of mind. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel had asked softly in the darkness. How different my life is now, she'd said, which was true enough. Good different or bad different? Just different. I'm still processing. He'd kissed her temple. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. That had been the problem, Brianna had thought. Daniel wasn't going anywhere. He was committed to this marriage completely. He loved her genuinely. And she was the one who'd used that love to get what she needed. She'd closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but guilt had kept her awake for hours. Guilt and the growing realization that she might have just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because somewhere along the way, between the calculated courtship and the carefully planned engagement, something unexpected had happened. Brianna had started to develop real feelings for Daniel. Not the grateful admiration she'd started with, but genuine affection and care. Which made everything worse. Because now she wasn't just deceiving Daniel. She was deceiving herself about her own motivations. She couldn't even be sure anymore what she felt or why she'd married him. All she knew for certain was that she was now Mrs. Daniel Morrison, living in a mansion with a man who loved her completely, and the weight of her deception was heavier than any medical bill or eviction notice ever could have been. Her grandmother was safe. That was what mattered. She'd repeat that to herself as many times as necessary until she believed it was worth the cost. Even if the cost was her soul. The first month of marriage had been an adjustment period. Brianna had moved her belongings into Daniel's mansion, trying to make the cavernous house feel like home. Daniel had cleared out an entire wing on the second floor to create an art studio for her, complete with north-facing windows and professional lighting. I want you to keep creating, he'd said when he'd shown her the space. Your art is important. Don't let being married to me change that. The studio was beautiful. It was more than she'd ever dreamed of having. And every time Brianna walked into it, she felt the weight of Daniel's generosity pressing down on her like a physical thing. She'd started a new series of paintings, trying to work through her complicated feelings. But everything she created felt dishonest, like she was painting lies instead of truth. She'd end up staring at blank canvases for hours, unable to capture anything real. Daniel had noticed. Are you okay? You seem distant lately. Just adjusting, she'd said, which was becoming her standard response to everything. Her grandmother's health had continued to improve. The follow-up treatments were going well, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about her prognosis. Brianna visited her twice a week at the rehabilitation facility where she was regaining her strength. How's married life? Florence had asked during one visit. Good. Daniel is wonderful. But. No buts, Grandma. Everything is fine. Florence had given her a knowing look. Baby girl, I've known you your whole life. Something's bothering you. Brianna had almost confessed everything right then. Almost told her grandmother the truth about why she'd married Daniel, about the guilt that was eating her alive, about the growing feeling she had for him that made everything more complicated. But she couldn't. Her grandmother was finally healthy. She was happy. Telling her the truth would only cause pain and potentially make her sick with worry. So Brianna had smiled and changed the subject. The money had been the hardest part to navigate. Daniel had put Brianna's name on all his accounts the day after the wedding. What's mine is yours, he'd said simply. I trust you completely. That trust had felt like a knife. Brianna had access to more money than she'd ever seen in her life, and she was using it to continue paying for her grandmother's care without Daniel even knowing that's where it was going. She'd set up automatic transfers to the medical facility, withdrawing cash to avoid leaving a clear paper trail. 5,000 here, 3,000 there. Daniel had so much money that he'd never noticed the amounts missing. But Brianna noticed. She kept track of every penny, planning to pay it all back someday somehow. She'd started a secret savings account in her own name, putting money aside from the household budget. It would take years, maybe decades, to accumulate enough to repay Daniel for everything. But she was going to try. Living in the mansion had its own surreal quality. Brianna had grown up in a small apartment with her grandmother, sharing a bedroom until she was 12. Then she'd moved to her studio apartment, barely bigger than Daniel's walk-in closet. Now she had an entire mansion, more rooms than she knew what to do with. Daniel had hired a housekeeper who came 3 times a week. He had a chef who prepared meals. He had a gardener for the extensive grounds. Brianna felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. But the hardest part was Daniel himself. He was so genuinely kind, so genuinely in love with her. He'd surprise her with flowers. He'd cook dinner with her on the housekeeper's days off. He'd sit in her studio and watch her work, asking thoughtful questions about her process. What made you choose art? He'd asked one evening, sitting on the floor of her studio while she stood at her easel. My mom was an artist, Brianna had said. After she died, painting was the only way I could feel close to her. Like she was still teaching me something. She'd be proud of you. I hope so. I know so. Your work is incredible, Brianna. You have a gift. These moments had been making everything harder. Because the more time she spent with Daniel, the more she genuinely liked him. He was funny and thoughtful. He listened when she talked. He supported her dreams. Under different circumstances, she really could have fallen in love with him naturally. But these weren't different circumstances. She'd married him under false pretenses, and that fact colored everything. 2 months into the marriage, Daniel's business partner had thrown them a party to celebrate their union. It had been a formal affair at a country club, with hundreds of guests Brianna didn't know. She'd worn a red cocktail dress and played the role of the loving wife perfectly. Your husband is so smitten with you, one woman had gushed. It's adorable how he can't take his eyes off you. Brianna had smiled politely and made small talk, all while feeling like a fraud. These people thought they were seeing a love story. They had no idea they were watching a performance. Daniel had introduced her to everyone, his hand always on her lower back, his pride evident in his voice. This is my wife, Brianna. She's an incredible artist. People had asked about her work, about how they'd met, about their wedding. Brianna had told the sanitized version of their story, leaving out the desperation and calculation. She'd made it sound romantic. The gallery meeting, the instant connection, the whirlwind courtship. It had sounded believable because parts of it were true. There had been a connection at the gallery. The courtship had been intense. The wedding had been beautiful. She'd just left out the part where she'd orchestrated all of it for financial gain. Late that night, back at the mansion, Daniel had pulled her into his arms in their bedroom. Thank you for tonight. I know those events can be exhausting. It was fine. Everyone was nice. I'm the luckiest man alive, he'd said, kissing her forehead. I still can't believe you said yes when I proposed. Guilt had twisted in Brianna's stomach. Why wouldn't I? You're wonderful. I don't know. Sometimes I worry I'm not enough for you. That you married me too quickly and you'll realize you made a mistake. The irony had been crushing. Daniel was worried he wasn't enough, while Brianna was the one who'd married him under false pretenses. You're more than enough, she'd said and meant it. That was the terrible truth. Daniel was more than enough. He was kind and generous and loving. Any woman would be lucky to be married to him. But Brianna had gotten here through manipulation, which meant she didn't deserve any of it. 3 months into the marriage, things had started to feel almost normal. Brianna had gotten used to the house, to the lifestyle, to playing the role of Daniel's wife. She'd fallen into routines. Morning coffee together, painting in her studio during the day, dinner with Daniel in the evening, quiet nights reading or watching movies together. It had felt dangerously close to real happiness. That's when the complications had started. Brianna had been making one of her usual transfers to pay for her grandmother's ongoing physical therapy when Daniel had walked into the study unexpectedly. What are you doing? He'd asked casually. Brianna had minimized the screen quickly. Just checking our accounts. Everything okay? Yes, fine. Just making sure all the bills are paid. He'd come over and kissed the top of her head. You don't need to worry about bills anymore. That's what the accountant is for. I know. Old habits. After he'd left the room, Brianna had sat there with her heart pounding. That had been too close. She needed to be more careful. But being more careful meant being more secretive. And being more secretive meant more lies. And more lies meant more guilt. It was becoming a cycle she couldn't escape. Every secret transfer, every coded phone call to the medical facility, every moment of playing the perfect wife while hiding her true reasons for being there added to the weight she was carrying. And the worst part was that she was starting to care about Daniel in ways that went beyond gratitude. She'd catch herself looking forward to his return from work. She'd smile genuinely when he told her about his day. She'd reach for his hand automatically when they walked together. She was falling for him, which made everything infinitely more complicated. Because how could you fall in love with someone you deceived so thoroughly? How could real feelings grow in soil poisoned by lies? But here's the real question. Is it possible to build something real on a foundation of deception? Can love grow from lies? Comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to see how Brianna's carefully constructed world is about to come crashing down. Because Daniel is starting to notice the cracks, and the truth is closer than Brianna realizes. Late at night, lying beside Daniel while he slept, Brianna would stare at the ceiling and wonder what would happen when the truth came out. And it would come out. Secrets like hers never stayed buried forever. She just hoped that when it did, the real feelings she'd developed for Daniel would count for something. That somehow, the love that had grown despite the lies might be enough to save them both. But deep down, she knew she was probably just adding another layer of deception to an already unstable foundation. And sooner or later the whole thing would collapse. It was just a matter of time. The first real crack appeared 4 months into the marriage. Daniel had come home early from work and found Brianna on the phone in the study, door closed. She'd been talking to the rehabilitation center about her grandmother's payment schedule, confirming the next transfer. "Yes, I'll have the money to you by Friday," she'd been saying when Daniel had opened the door. She turned, startled, and had ended the call quickly. "I have to go. I'll call back later." "Everything okay?" Daniel had asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Fine. Just handling some business." "What kind of business?" "Nothing important." "How was work?" She'd changed the subject, but Daniel had looked at her strangely. It was the first time Brianna had seen doubt in his eyes, and it had terrified her. Over the next few weeks, more cracks appeared. Daniel had started asking questions about her days, about where she'd been, about why she sometimes seemed distracted. He'd noticed the pattern of her leaving the house on certain days without explanation. He'd commented on how secretive she was with her phone. "I feel like you're pulling away from me," he'd said one evening over dinner. "Like there's this wall between us that wasn't there before." "I'm not pulling away," Brianna had protested. "I'm just adjusting to married life. It's a big change. It's been 4 months. How much more adjusting do you need?" She hadn't had a good answer for that. The truth was, the longer she lived with Daniel, the harder it became to maintain the deception. Not because he was suspicious, but because she was falling in love with him for real, and that made every lie feel like a betrayal. Her grandmother had been discharged from the rehabilitation center and had moved into a nice assisted living facility. Daniel had visited with Brianna, bringing Florence flowers and sitting with her for hours, listening to her stories about Brianna's childhood. "He's good to you," Florence had said after Daniel had left. "Don't mess this up, baby girl." "I'm trying, Grandma." "Are you? Because you seem troubled. Like you're carrying something heavy." Brianna had wanted to confess everything. The weight of the secret was becoming unbearable. But she just kissed her grandmother's cheek and changed the subject. The real trouble had started when Daniel's accountant had called him about unusual withdrawals from their joint account. They'd been sitting at breakfast when he'd taken the call, and Brianna had watched his expression change from casual to confused to concerned. "What kind of withdrawals?" he'd asked. "How much?" Brianna had felt her stomach drop. She'd been so careful, keeping the amounts small enough that she'd thought Daniel wouldn't notice. But apparently, small amounts added up over time. After the call, Daniel had looked at her. "Did you know there have been regular cash withdrawals from our account? A few thousand here and there over the past 4 months. I've been buying things," Brianna had said quickly. "Art supplies, gifts for my grandmother." $30,000 in art supplies? It adds up. You know how expensive good materials are. He'd studied her face for a long moment. "Brianna, if you need money for something, you can just tell me. We're married. There's no reason to be secretive about it." "I know. I'm sorry. I should have mentioned it." But the damage was done. She'd seen the first real seeds of doubt take root in Daniel's mind. He'd started watching her more carefully, noticing patterns she'd thought were invisible. 2 weeks later, she'd come home from visiting her grandmother to find Daniel in the study, looking through bank statements. "What are you doing?" she'd asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Trying to figure out where $30,000 went." He'd looked up at her. "Because I asked at the art supply store you frequent, and they said you haven't spent more than a few $100s there in months." Brianna had felt her world tilting. "You checked up on me? I'm trying to understand what's going on. You're being secretive, money is disappearing, and you keep lying to me about it. What am I supposed to think?" "You're supposed to trust me." "I want to trust you, Brianna. But you're making it really hard." They'd had their first real fight that night. Daniel had pressed for answers about where the money was going. Brianna had deflected and evaded, unable to tell him the truth but also unable to come up with a convincing lie. They'd gone to bed angry, sleeping on opposite sides of the mattress for the first time since the wedding. The next morning, Daniel had apologized for pushing too hard. But Brianna had seen that the doubt hadn't gone away. It was there in his eyes every time he looked at her, a question mark where there used to be certainty. She tried to be more careful after that. She'd stopped making large transfers. She'd been more attentive to Daniel, trying to rebuild the trust she'd damaged. But it was like trying to hold water in her hands. The more she grasped, the more it slipped away. Daniel's business partner, Michael, had started making comments too. He'd pulled Daniel aside at a company event and said something that Daniel had later shared with Brianna. "Michael thinks you might be using me," Daniel had said, his voice careful. He says it's suspicious that you married me so quickly after I paid for your grandmother's surgery. Brianna had felt sick. That's not true. Michael doesn't even know me. I know. I told him that. But he has a point about the timing. Are you saying you think I married you for money? No. But I am saying that I'm confused. Because the woman I married was open and honest, and lately you've been secretive and distant. So help me understand what changed. She'd wanted to tell him everything in that moment. To explain about the medical bills, about her desperation, about how the marriage had started as a calculated choice but had become something real. But the words had stuck in her throat, trapped behind years of practice at keeping secrets. Nothing changed, she'd lied. I'm just stressed about my art. I've been struggling creatively. It had been partially true. Her art had suffered. She'd been unable to create anything honest because her entire life was a lie. But it wasn't the real reason for her behavior, and Daniel had known it. 5 months into the marriage, Daniel had done something that had shaken Brianna to her core. He'd hired a private investigator. She'd found out by accident. A business card had fallen out of his jacket pocket when she'd been taking his clothes to the dry cleaner. James Mitchell, private investigator. Discreet inquiries for personal and business matters. Brianna had stood in their bedroom, staring at that card, and had felt her carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Daniel didn't trust her. He was having her investigated. And when that investigator dug into her life, he'd find everything. The timeline of their relationship. The dates of the medical bills. The pattern of transfers. He'd find proof that she'd married Daniel for money. She'd confronted him that evening, card in hand. What is this? Daniel had looked tired. Exactly what it looks like. You hired someone to investigate me? I hired someone to help me understand what's happening in my own marriage. Because my wife won't tell me the truth. I've been telling you the truth. Have you? Because it feels like every conversation we have is full of evasions and half-truths. You're hiding something, Brianna. And I need to know what it is. They'd fought again, worse this time. Brianna had accused him of not trusting her. Daniel had accused her of giving him no reason to trust her. They'd said things in anger that couldn't be taken back. That night, they'd slept in separate rooms for the first time since the wedding. Brianna had lain awake, staring at the ceiling of the guest room, knowing that the end was coming. The investigator would find the truth. Daniel would learn that she'd manipulated him, married him for his money, lied to him for months. Everything would fall apart. She thought about running, packing her things and leaving before Daniel could discover the full extent of her deception. But she couldn't do it. Not just because her grandmother still needed care, but because somewhere along the way she'd fallen genuinely in love with Daniel. And the thought of losing him, of seeing hurt and betrayal replace the love in his eyes, was more than she could bear. So she'd stayed. And waited. And tried to prepare herself for the moment when her lies would be exposed and her marriage would end. The cracks in their foundation were growing wider every day. It was only a matter of time before everything collapsed entirely. The investigator's report had arrived in a manila envelope, delivered to Daniel's office on a Tuesday afternoon. Brianna had been in her studio when he'd come home early, and she'd known from the look on his face that everything was about to change. We need to talk, Daniel had said, standing in the doorway with the envelope in his hand. Brianna had set down her paintbrush with trembling hands. What's that? The truth, apparently. He'd walked into the studio and closed the door behind him. The truth that you've been hiding from me for 6 months. Her mouth had gone dry. Daniel, I can explain. Can you? Because I'm really curious how you're going to explain this. He'd pulled papers from the envelope and held them up. A detailed timeline of our relationship, cross-referenced with your grandmother's medical bills. Do you want to know what it shows? Brianna had felt tears starting to form but had blinked them back. What does it show? It shows that Florence was diagnosed with lung cancer 3 weeks before you met me. It shows that the hospital set her surgery date for 2 months out. It shows that you needed $60,000 within 6 weeks or she'd miss her window for treatment. He'd been speaking calmly, but Brianna could hear the pain underneath the control. And it shows that I proposed to you exactly 5 weeks after we met. Just in time for you to secure the financial resources you needed. It's not like that, Brianna had whispered, but the words had sounded hollow even to her. No? Then what is it like? Because from where I'm standing it looks like you identified a mark, calculated exactly how to manipulate him, and executed your plan perfectly. You married me for my money, Brianna. Just like Michael warned me you might have. I married you because I was desperate. The words had burst out of her, carried on a wave of emotion she couldn't control anymore. My grandmother was dying. I had no money, no options, no way to save her. And then you walked into that gallery, kind and generous and interested in me, and yes, I saw an opportunity. I saw a way to save the person who raised me and loved me and sacrificed everything for me. So you seduced me? Used my feelings against me? At first, yes. Tears were streaming down her face now. At first, that's exactly what I did. I calculated every move. I made myself into exactly what you were looking for. I manipulated you into falling in love with me so you'd want to marry me and I'd have access to the money I needed to save my grandmother. Daniel had flinched like she'd slapped him. At least you're finally being honest. But it changed, Brianna had continued desperately. Somewhere along the way it stopped being a calculation and started being real. I fell in love with you, Daniel. Actually in love with you. Not with your money or your lifestyle or what you could give me. With you. The way you listen to people. The way you care about things. The way you make me laugh. The way you look at me like I matter. How am I supposed to believe that? How am I supposed to believe anything you say when the foundation of our entire relationship is a lie? I don't know, Brianna had admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know how to prove something like that. But it's true. I love you. And I have for months now. It's been killing me to keep this secret from you. Then why did you? Why not just tell me the truth? Because I was afraid of this. Of seeing you look at me like you are right now. Of losing you. Daniel had laughed bitterly. You never had me. Not really. The woman I fell in love with doesn't even exist. She was just a character you played. That's not fair. Yes, I deceived you about why I married you. But everything else was real. Our conversations, our connection, the life we've been building. That's all real. Is it? Or is that just what you're telling yourself to feel less guilty about what you did? Brianna hadn't had an answer for that. She'd asked herself the same question so many times that she no longer knew what was true and what was rationalization. Daniel had sat down heavily in the chair by her easel, the fight seeming to drain out of him. The report also shows the transfers. The money you've been withdrawing from our account to pay for your grandmother's ongoing care. Why didn't you just ask me for that money? Why did you have to steal it? Because I didn't want to take any more from you than I already had. I was planning to pay it all back, every penny. I've been saving money slowly but surely. I don't care about the money, Brianna. I've never cared about the money. I would have paid for all of your grandmother's care if you just asked. I would have done it happily because I love you. He'd looked at her then, and the pain in his eyes had been worse than any anger could have been. Or I thought I loved you. Now I don't even know who you are. I'm the same person I've always been. Flawed and desperate and trying to do the best I can with impossible choices. You had choices. You could have been honest with me from the beginning. You could have told me about your grandmother's illness, about your financial situation. I would have helped you. Would you? We just met. Why would you give a stranger $60,000? Because I was already falling for you. Because even in that first conversation at the gallery, I knew there was something special about you. If you'd given me the chance, I would have helped without needing the manipulation. The worst part was that Brianna believed him. Daniel was exactly that kind of person. Kind enough, generous enough, to help someone in need without expecting anything in return. She'd manipulated him when she hadn't needed to, and that made everything so much worse. I'm sorry, she'd whispered. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I regret every lie. Every moment of deception. If I could go back and do it differently, I would. But you can't. And now here we are. He'd stood up, still holding the investigator's report. I need time to think. To figure out what this means for us. Are you leaving me? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. He'd walked to the door, then paused. The terrible thing is, even knowing all of this, I still love you. Some part of me still hopes that the woman I married actually exists somewhere beneath the lies. But I don't know if I can trust that feeling anymore. After he'd left the studio, Brianna had collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading for months. The truth was out, and it was destroying everything just as she'd known it would. She'd thought about what she should do. Pack her things and leave? Fight for the marriage? Beg Daniel for forgiveness? But she'd been too emotionally exhausted to make any decisions. So she just sat there on the studio floor, surrounded by her paintings, and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. Hours later, there'd been a knock on the studio door. Daniel had come back in looking tired and sad. I talked to your grandmother, he'd said. Brianna had felt panic spike through her. You what? I went to her assisted living facility and told her everything. I needed to hear her side of the story. What did she say? She said she had no idea you'd married me for financial reasons. That she'd thought we were genuinely in love. That if she'd known the truth, she would have refused my help and dealt with the consequences. Daniel had sat down on the floor beside Brianna. She also said that she's seen how you look at me over these past months, and that whatever your initial intentions were, your feelings now are real. They are real, Brianna had insisted. I promise you they're real. I want to believe that. But I don't know how. They'd sat in silence for a long time, two people who'd started with lies and found something genuine in the midst of them, trying to figure out if that was enough to build a future on. Finally, Daniel had spoken again. I'm not leaving. Not yet, anyway. But things need to change. We need to start over with honesty this time. I need to learn who you really are, not who you pretended to be. I'll tell you anything you want to know, Brianna had said eagerly. I'll be completely honest from now on. No more secrets, no more lies. I hope so. Because if I find out you're still hiding things from me, that's it. I'm done. I can forgive one terrible choice made out of desperation, but I can't live in a relationship without trust. You won't have to, Brianna had promised. No more lies. I swear. And for the first time in 6 months, she'd meant it completely. Because she'd just learned the hard way that lies might get you what you need in the short term, but in the long term, they destroyed everything worth having. The days following Daniel's discovery were the hardest of Brianna's life. They'd agreed to stay together and try to rebuild, but the atmosphere in the mansion was tense and uncomfortable. Daniel was polite but distant. He slept in the guest room. He came home late from work. They ate dinner together in silence, neither knowing what to say. Brianna had kept her promise about honesty. She'd sat Daniel down and told him everything. Every detail of her desperation before they'd met. Every calculation she'd made during their courtship. Every moment she'd questioned her own choices. She'd held nothing back even when the truth made her look worse. I need you to understand how desperate I was, she'd said. My grandmother raised me after my parents died. She gave up everything for me. Her retirement savings, her plans for the future, her own dreams. Also I could have a good life. When she got sick, I couldn't just let her die. I couldn't. I understand desperation, Daniel had said. What I don't understand is why you continued the deception after we were married. After I'd already paid for everything. What was the point of continuing to steal money if you had access to all you needed? Pride, I guess. And guilt. I didn't want to take more from you than I already had. I wanted to handle her ongoing care myself, to prove I wasn't completely dependent on you. That doesn't make sense. We're married. My money is your money. There's no taking from me. But there is, because the marriage started as a lie. Every dollar I spent felt like money I'd stolen because I got access to it under false pretenses. They'd had many conversations like this, circling around the same points, trying to understand each other. Daniel was trying to see things from Brianna's perspective, but the hurt was still too fresh. A week after the discovery, Florence had asked to see both of them. They'd driven to the assisted living facility together, the car ride quiet and awkward. Florence had been waiting in her room, dressed in a maroon cardigan and looking stronger than she had in months. Sit down, both of you, she'd said, gesturing to the small couch. They'd sat, careful not to touch, while Florence had studied them with sharp eyes. Daniel told me what happened, Florence had begun. How Brianna married you to save my life. And I have some things to say about that. Grandma, please, Brianna had started, but Florence had held up a hand. First to you, baby girl. What you did was wrong. Deeply wrong. I raised you better than to use people, no matter how good your intentions were. I'm ashamed that you thought I'd want to be saved at the cost of your integrity. Brianna had felt tears welling up. I'm sorry, Grandma. I just couldn't let you die. I know. And that's the only reason I'm not angrier than I am. But you need to understand that love, real love, doesn't involve deception. It's built on honesty and trust and respect. What you did to Daniel wasn't love. It was manipulation. I know that now. Florence had turned to Daniel then. And you? I'm grateful for what you did for me. More grateful than I can express. But I want you to know that I had no idea about Brianna's motivations. I thought she'd married you because she loved you. If I'd known the truth, I would have refused your help. I believe you, Daniel had said gently. Good. Now here's what I think. I've watched you two together over these past months. I've seen how Brianna lights up when you walk in the room. I've seen how you look at her like she hung the stars. Whatever this relationship started as, it's become something real. The question is whether you're both brave enough to save it. I don't know if I can trust her again, Daniel had admitted. Every time she says she loves me, I wonder if it's true or if she's just saying what I want to hear. That's fair. Trust has to be earned, and Brianna broke yours badly. But I also know my granddaughter. She doesn't lie about her feelings. When she says she loves you, she means it. The problem is that she spent so long pretending that she doesn't know how to be genuine anymore. Brianna had looked at her grandmother with gratitude and shame in equal measure. Florence understood her in ways no one else did even now. What should I do? Daniel had asked Florence, and Brianna had been struck by how young he'd sounded in that moment. How lost? That's up to you. But I'll tell you this, real love is messy. It's complicated. It doesn't always start in the perfect way. Sometimes it begins in darkness and grows toward light. Sometimes it starts with terrible choices and finds redemption. The question isn't whether Brianna made mistakes. The question is whether you can forgive those mistakes and build something new together. They'd left the assisted living facility with Florence's words hanging between them. That night, Daniel had come to find Brianna in her studio. I've been thinking about what your grandmother said, he'd begun. And I think she's right. About the messy part, at least. Nothing about us has been clean or simple. But that doesn't mean it's not real. Brianna had set down her brush. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to try. Really try. To rebuild what we had, but on a foundation of honesty this time. He'd walked closer. I'm saying that despite everything, I still love you. And I think you really do love me too. So maybe we can start over. Get to know each other without the lies. I'd like that, Brianna had said, hope blooming in her chest for the first time in weeks. I'd like that more than anything. But we're doing this right. No more secrets. No more hiding. Something's wrong, you tell me? If you need something, you ask. We're a team or we're nothing. We're a team, Brianna had agreed. I promise. That night, Daniel had moved back into their bedroom. They'd lain in bed talking until dawn, really talking about their fears and hopes and dreams. Brianna had told him about her childhood, about the poverty and struggle, about the deep fear of losing people she loved. Daniel had shared his own vulnerabilities about feeling isolated by his success, about wanting connection more than anything. It had been the most honest conversation they'd ever had, and by the end of it, Brianna had felt something shift. They weren't healed yet. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a single night. But they'd taken the first real step toward something genuine. Over the next few weeks, they'd continued the process of rebuilding. They'd gone to couples therapy, where they'd worked through Brianna's patterns of deception and Daniel's difficulty with forgiveness. They'd had difficult conversations about money, about boundaries, about what they both needed to feel secure in the relationship. Slowly things had gotten better. The tension had eased. The silences had become comfortable again. They'd started laughing together, cooking together, being affectionate without it feeling forced. One night, about a month after the discovery, they'd been washing dishes together when Daniel had said, I forgive you. Brianna had dropped the plate she was holding back into the soapy water. What? I forgive you. For the lies, for the manipulation, for all of it. I understand why you did it. I don't agree with your choices, but I understand them. And I'm choosing to forgive you and move forward. Brianna had turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. You don't know how much that means to me. I do know. Because I need you to forgive me too. For what? For having you investigated. For doubting you. For being so caught up in my hurt that I couldn't see you were suffering too. We both made mistakes in this relationship. Maybe we can forgive each other and build something better. She'd kissed him then, really kissed him for the first time since the truth had come out. And it had felt different than before. More real. More solid. Built on actual understanding rather than carefully maintained illusions. That night they'd made love like it was their first time. Vulnerable and honest and present with each other in ways they hadn't been before. Afterward, lying in Daniel's arms, Brianna had felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. I love you, she'd whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Daniel had replied. The real you. All of you. Even the parts that make terrible choices out of love. And Brianna had realized that this was what she'd been searching for all along. Not financial security or a solution to her problems, but this. Someone who knew all her flaws and failures and loved her anyway. Someone she could be completely honest with and still feel safe. It had taken lies and pain and almost losing everything to get here. But maybe that was what Florence had meant about love being messy. Maybe the best relationships weren't the ones that started perfectly, but the ones that survived imperfection and came out stronger on the other side. 3 months after the discovery, Brianna and Daniel had established a new rhythm. They'd both been committed to transparency and were learning to navigate their relationship with honesty as the foundation. Daniel had insisted on taking over all of Florence's medical expenses officially, setting up a trust specifically for her ongoing care. "No more sneaking around," he'd said. "Your grandmother's health is our shared responsibility now." Brianna had tried to protest, but Daniel had been firm. "This is what family does. And Florence is family now. Let me do this, please." So she'd learned to accept help without guilt, which had been harder than she'd expected. All her life, she'd been taught to be independent, to handle her own problems. Relying on Daniel had felt like weakness at first. But gradually she'd come to understand that accepting support wasn't weakness. It was trust. They'd also started being more transparent about money. Daniel had sat down with Brianna and gone through their entire financial situation. He'd shown her his business accounts, his investments, his plans for the future. He'd made her a joint partner in all financial decisions. "I don't want you to ever feel desperate again," he'd said. "I want you to know that we're secure, that your grandmother is taken care of, that you're safe. No more fear. No more secrets." Brianna had cried during that conversation, overwhelmed by his generosity and trust. After everything she'd done, he was still choosing to be vulnerable with her. Still choosing to believe in their future together. Her art had started flowing again too. With the weight of deception lifted, she'd been able to create honest work. She'd started a new series about transformation and redemption, paintings that explored the journey from darkness to light. A gallery owner had seen her new work and had offered her a solo exhibition. It would be her first major show, a chance to establish herself as a serious artist independent of Daniel's connections or money. "You don't need me to succeed," Daniel had told her when she'd shared the news. "You're talented enough on your own. You always were." The exhibition was scheduled for 6 months out, giving Brianna plenty of time to create enough pieces. She'd thrown herself into her work with renewed passion, painting from dawn until dusk, finally creating the art she'd always wanted to make. Daniel had been supportive in ways that continued to surprise her. He'd sit in her studio for hours, just being present while she worked. He'd offer thoughtful feedback when she asked for it and stay quiet when she needed to focus. He'd celebrate her small victories and encourage her through creative blocks. "You're really good at this," Brianna had told him one evening. "Supporting me without taking over. How did you learn to do that?" "Therapy mostly," he'd admitted with a laugh. "Our counselor helped me understand that my instinct to solve every problem isn't always helpful. Sometimes you just need me to be present, not to fix things." They'd been going to couples therapy weekly, working through the lingering issues from their rough start. The therapist had helped Brianna understand her patterns of secretiveness and self-reliance. She'd helped Daniel work through his hurt and learn to trust again. "The foundation of your relationship was damaged," the therapist had explained. "But that doesn't mean the whole structure has to come down. You can rebuild the foundation while maintaining the parts of your relationship that are healthy and real." And that's what they'd been doing. Rebuilding. One honest conversation at a time. One vulnerable moment at a time. One choice to show up for each other at a time. Florence had been thriving too. The treatments had worked and she'd been declared cancer-free. She'd regained her strength and had even started volunteering at the assisted living facility, organizing activities for other residents. "I've got a second chance at life," she told Brianna during one visit. "I'm not going to waste it." Brianna and Daniel had brought her to the mansion for dinner every Sunday, establishing a new tradition. Florence and Daniel had developed their own relationship, independent of Brianna. They'd play cards together and swap stories and tease each other like old friends. "He's a good man," Florence had told Brianna privately. "You made a lot of mistakes, baby girl, but marrying him wasn't one of them. Even if you did it for the wrong reasons initially, you ended up exactly where you needed to be." 6 months after the truth had come out, Daniel had surprised Brianna with a trip. Not a vacation, but a visit to her parents' graves. She hadn't been since the funeral years ago, too busy with survival to make time for grief. They'd driven to the small cemetery where her parents were buried. Daniel had waited in the car while Brianna had approached their headstones alone. She'd knelt in the grass and told them everything. About her struggles, about Daniel, about the terrible choices she'd made and the redemption she'd found. "I wish you could meet him," she'd said to the granite markers. "I think you'd like him. He's kind like you were, Dad. And strong like you were, Mom. He sees me, really sees me and loves me anyway. I know I don't deserve that, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it." When she'd come back to the car, Daniel had held her while she cried. He hadn't asked questions or tried to make her talk. He'd just been there, solid and steady, while she processed emotions she'd been holding back for years. That night, in their hotel room, Brianna had told Daniel things she'd never shared with anyone. About her parents' death, about the trauma of losing them so young, about the deep-seated fear of abandonment that had driven so many of her choices. "I understand now why you did what you did," Daniel had said. "You weren't just trying to save your grandmother. You were trying to avoid experiencing that loss again, that feeling of being completely helpless while someone you love dies." "Yes," Brianna had whispered. "That's exactly it. But you're not helpless anymore. You're not alone. You have me and I'm not going anywhere. No matter what happens with your grandmother, with your art, with anything, I'm here. You don't have to face loss alone ever again." It had been the most healing conversation of Brianna's life. And it had happened because she'd finally been honest, finally let Daniel see all of her, even the damaged and fearful parts. They'd returned from the trip closer than ever, ready to fully commit to the life they were building together. A life based on truth, trust, and genuine love. "I want to renew our vows," Daniel had said one evening. "Not because the first wedding wasn't real, but because I want to make new promises. Ones based on who we really are, not who we were pretending to be." "I'd like that," Brianna had agreed. A fresh start. A real beginning. They'd started planning a vow renewal ceremony for a few months out. Nothing big or fancy, just them in Florence and a few close friends. A chance to stand before each other and make promises they both fully understood and meant completely. Brianna had also made a decision about the money she owed Daniel. She told him she wanted to donate an equivalent amount to a charity that helped families facing medical crises. "I can't pay you back directly," she'd said. "You won't let me. But I can pay it forward. Help other families who are in the situation I was in, so they don't have to make the choices I made." Daniel had loved the idea. They'd established a foundation together, funding it with the money Brianna had taken plus matching funds from Daniel. The Brianna and Daniel Morrison Foundation would provide grants to families facing financial crises due to medical emergencies. "We're turning something bad into something good," Daniel had said. "Taking the worst mistake of our relationship and using it to help others." It had felt right. Redemptive. Like they were taking the pain and shame of their beginnings and transforming it into hope for others. As Brianna worked on her paintings for the upcoming exhibition, she'd found herself creating a new piece. A self-portrait showing her transformation over the past year. On one side of the canvas, she was lost in shadows, desperate and afraid. On the other side, she stood in light, hand reaching toward someone just out of frame. She called it Finding Home in Unexpected Places, and it was the most honest piece she'd ever created. Daniel had seen it and had stood in front of it for a long time, not saying anything. Finally, he turned to her with tears in his eyes. "That's us, isn't it? The journey from darkness to light. From lies to truth. From using each other to actually seeing each other." "Yes," Brianna had said. "That's exactly what it is." He'd pulled her into his arms then, and she'd felt the final pieces of her broken self click into place. This was home. Not the mansion, not the money, not even the security. This, being held by someone who knew every terrible thing about her and chose to love her anyway. They'd come so far from that night at the gallery when Brianna had first identified Daniel as a mark. They'd survived lies and pain and almost losing everything. And they'd emerged on the other side with something genuine and real and worth fighting for. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd thought she wanted when she was a child. It was better. Because it was real, built on actual understanding and forgiveness and choice. They'd chosen each other over and over, through the worst of circumstances. And they'd keep choosing each other, every day for the rest of their lives. 9 months after the truth had come out, Brianna stood in the Riverside Gallery, surrounded by her new paintings. The exhibition had opened an hour ago, and the response had been overwhelming. People stood in front of her work with genuine interest, having real conversations about the themes of transformation and redemption she'd explored. Daniel was there, of course, standing near the back of the gallery with Florence beside him in her wheelchair. They were both beaming with pride, but they'd given Brianna space to experience her moment independently. Patricia, the gallery owner who'd given Brianna her first chance, walked over with a huge smile. 3 pieces sold already, and the night's just getting started. People are connecting with your work in a way I've rarely seen. Thank you for believing in me, Brianna said. For giving me this opportunity. You earned it. This work is powerful, Brianna. You're not just painting pretty pictures. You're telling stories that matter. As Patricia moved away to talk to other guests, Brianna took a moment to really look at her paintings. Each one represented a different stage of her journey over the past year. The desperation. The deception. The discovery. The pain. The healing. The love that had grown from it all. She'd been terrified to show work this personal, this revealing. But her therapist had encouraged her to be vulnerable in her art, to show people the messy reality of growth and change. Your story will resonate with others, the therapist had said. Not despite its imperfections but because of them. Everyone makes mistakes. Not everyone finds redemption. A woman approached Brianna, probably in her 50s, with tears in her eyes. I just wanted to thank you for this exhibition. For being honest about struggle and recovery. My sister is going through something similar, making difficult choices out of love and fear. Seeing your work gives me hope that people can come back from their mistakes. Brianna had found herself hugging this stranger, both of them crying. They can. I promise you they can. It's hard and it takes work, but redemption is possible. After the woman left, Daniel came over. How are you holding up? Good. Really good. This feels right, you know? Sharing my story, even the ugly parts. I'm proud of you. For your art, yes, but more for your courage. It takes bravery to be this honest. Florence wheeled herself over to join them. Baby girl, your parents would be so proud of who you've become. Not just the artist, but the woman who learned from her mistakes and grew. I hope so, Grandma. I know so. You took a terrible situation and turned it into something beautiful. That's what art is supposed to do, right? Transform pain into meaning. The three of them stood together, a family formed through circumstances both difficult and beautiful. Florence's cancer was in remission with excellent prognosis for staying that way. She'd moved out of the assisted living facility and into a small house near the mansion, close enough for regular visits but independent enough to maintain her dignity. Daniel had bought the house for her, and this time Brianna had accepted his generosity with grace and gratitude. Later that evening, after the exhibition had wound down and they'd returned to the mansion, Daniel had pulled Brianna aside. I have something for you. He'd handed her an envelope. Inside was a deed to a small building downtown. What is this? Brianna had asked, confused. It's an art studio. Well, technically it's an art center. Multiple studios that you can rent out to other struggling artists at below market rates. I know how hard it was for you to find affordable studio space. I thought maybe you could make it easier for others. Brianna had stared at the deed, overwhelmed. Daniel, this is too much. It's not. It's an investment in something that matters. Art matters. Artists matter. And you matter to me. I want to support your vision for helping others. She kissed him then, grateful beyond words. This was who Daniel was. Someone who didn't just talk about making a difference but actually did it. Someone who saw problems and created solutions. Thank you, she'd whispered against his lips. For this, for everything, for loving me when I didn't deserve it. You've always deserved it. You just didn't believe it yet. The next weekend, they'd held their vow renewal ceremony in the same botanical garden where they'd originally gotten married. But this time, everything was different. Florence was there, healthy and happy, sitting in the front row. Patricia was there with several of Brianna's artist friends. Michael, Daniel's business partner who'd once suspected Brianna's motives, was there too. He'd apologized to her months ago, admitting he'd been wrong to judge her so harshly. I didn't understand the full situation, he'd said. And I'm sorry for making things harder for you and Daniel. Brianna and Daniel stood under the same rose arch, holding hands. But unlike the first wedding, neither of them was hiding anything. They knew each other fully now, flaws and fears and all. And they'd chosen each other anyway. The officiant had asked them to share their new vows. Daniel went first. Brianna, a year ago I married you thinking I knew who you were. I was wrong. But now I really do know you. I know your capacity for love and sacrifice. I know your strength and your weakness. I know how you take your coffee and how you look when you're lost in creating art. I know what you sound like when you're crying and when you're laughing. I know the real you and I love every complicated, messy, beautiful part of you. I promise to continue growing with you, to face our problems together honestly, and to build a life based on truth and trust and unconditional love. I choose you today and always. Then it was Brianna's turn. She'd written her vows carefully, wanting to get them exactly right. Daniel, I married you for the wrong reasons. I manipulated you and lied to you and almost destroyed something precious before it had a chance to fully bloom. But somewhere in the midst of all my deception, something real grew. Real love. Real respect. Real partnership. You've taught me that I don't have to face the world alone. That accepting help isn't weakness. That honesty, even when it's painful, is always worth it. I promise to never lie to you again. To trust you with all of me, even the parts I'm ashamed of. To build our life together on a foundation of truth. and to love you with the same generous, forgiving love you've shown me. I choose you today and always. They'd exchanged new rings, simple gold bands engraved with the date of this ceremony rather than their first wedding. These rings represented who they really were together, not who they'd been pretending to be. When they'd kissed this time, it had felt like a true beginning. The foundation was solid now, built on honesty rather than lies. Everything that came after would be real. At the reception, Florence had given a toast. I've watched these two go through something that would have destroyed most relationships. They could have walked away from each other. Part of me thinks they probably should have. But they didn't. They chose the hard path of forgiveness and rebuilding. They chose love, even when it was messy and complicated. And now look at them. Stronger than ever, more honest than ever, ready to face whatever life brings them together. That's what real love looks like. Not the fairy tale version, but the actual, complicated, choose each other everyday version. I'm proud of both of you. Everyone had raised their glasses, and Brianna had felt tears streaming down her face. Happy tears this time. Healing tears. That night, back at the mansion, Brianna and Daniel had slow danced in their living room to music only they could hear. Are you happy? Daniel had asked. More than I've ever been. Which is strange, considering how terrible things were not that long ago. Maybe that's why you appreciate it so much. Because you know what it's like when things are dark. You don't take the light for granted. I don't take you for granted, Brianna had said seriously. I never will. I know how lucky I am that you gave me a second chance. We gave each other a second chance. I wasn't perfect through all this either. I could have been more understanding earlier. I could have tried harder to see things from your perspective. They'd held each other close, two imperfect people who'd found each other in the messiest possible way and had somehow made it work. A few months later, Brianna's art center had opened. The Riverside Arts Collective provided affordable studio space for 15 artists, along with communal exhibition space and mentorship programs. Brianna split her time between her own work and supporting emerging artists who reminded her of herself a year ago. Talented, desperate, struggling to survive while pursuing their passion. She'd also started teaching workshops on dealing with creative blocks and the emotional challenges of being an artist. She was honest with her students about her own struggles, about the mistakes she'd made, about the importance of integrity even when facing impossible choices. Art isn't just about technique, she'd tell her classes. It's about honesty. About being willing to show people who you really are, not who you think they want to see. That vulnerability, that honesty, that's what makes art powerful. The foundation she and Daniel had started was helping families too. They'd provided grants to 12 families in their first year, covering medical expenses that would have otherwise bankrupted them. Each family's story reminded Brianna of her own desperate situation a year ago, and each time they helped someone she felt a little more redeemed. One evening, a year after their vow renewal, Brianna and Daniel were in her studio. She was working on a new piece while he read nearby, the comfortable silence of longtime companions filling the space. Do you ever regret how we started? Brianna had asked suddenly. Daniel had looked up from his book. That's a complicated question. I regret the pain we went through. I regret the lies and the hurt. But I don't regret ending up here with you. And I don't know if we'd have this depth of understanding if we hadn't gone through all that. So you think maybe we needed the darkness to appreciate the light? Maybe. Or maybe I'm just good at finding silver linings. He'd smiled. What about you? Do you regret it? I regret hurting you. I regret starting our relationship with deception. But I don't regret marrying you. Even though my reasons were wrong initially, the outcome was right. You were right for me. We were right for each other. Even though it almost destroyed us? Maybe especially because it almost destroyed us and we survived anyway. We're stronger now than we would have been if everything had been easy. Daniel had set aside his book and come over to where Brianna was standing. He'd wrapped his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder. I love you, he'd said simply. The real you. All of you. I love you too. Thank you for giving me the chance to show you who I really am. They'd stood like that for a long time, looking at the painting Brianna was working on. It was a portrait of the two of them, hands clasped, standing at the edge of light. The title was Choosing Light, and it would be the centerpiece of her next exhibition. Because that's what they'd done really. Chosen light over darkness. Chosen honesty over deception. Chosen love over fear. It hadn't been easy. It had been painful and difficult and required both of them to be more vulnerable and brave than they'd known they could be. But they'd done it. They'd taken the worst possible beginning and transformed it into something genuine and beautiful and real. They'd found each other in the darkness and had walked together toward the light. And now, standing in her studio with Daniel's arms around her and her grandmother healthy and her art career thriving and a life full of purpose and meaning stretching out before her, Brianna understood something important. Sometimes the best stories don't start with, "once upon a time." Sometimes they start with mistakes and desperation and impossible choices. But they can still end with, "happily ever after," as long as you're willing to do the hard work of turning lies into truth and pain into growth and fear into love. Brianna and Daniel had done that work. And they'd keep doing it every day for the rest of their lives. Because that's what real love required, not perfection but persistence. Not a fairy tale beginning, but a commitment to writing a better ending together. They'd started with deception. But they built something true. And that truth, hard-won and painfully earned, was worth more than any fairy tale could ever be.